The sky was painted in shades of grey, the clouds thick and heavy as the rain began to fall, drenching the world in a soft, relentless rhythm. The park, usually a place of solace, felt eerily still. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the wind. But there was something in the air, something wrong. Margaret Jensen pulled her coat tighter around her as she walked along the empty pathway. Her shoes clicked sharply against the wet pavement, the sound echoing into the silence, mingling with the distant hum of the city. She had walked this route hundreds of times before, but today it felt different. The air was thick, as if the world itself were holding its breath. She rounded the corner by the old oak tree and froze. There he was, a boy, no, a teenager, standing near the fountain, his face partially obscured by the hood of his sweatshirt. His posture was tense, like he was waiting for something, or perhaps someone. His eyes, dark and unreadable, flicked up and locked onto hers. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, his gaze piercing through her, and she felt a chill run down her spine. He was too still, too quiet, too out of place. Her mind raced, trying to place him. She'd seen people like him before, his kind, his type. She had read the stories, heard the news. A boy of his age, alone, in this part of town. He didn't belong here. Something felt off about him, like a dark cloud hanging over his presence. She didn't know why, but she felt an instinctive pang of fear. Her heartbeat quickened. Her thoughts spiraled. What was he doing here? Was he going to cause trouble? She felt her fingers twitch towards her purse, where her phone lay within easy reach. It was ridiculous, she told herself. She had no reason to be scared. But there was something in the air, something she couldn't explain. Without realizing it, she took a step back, then another. The boy was still staring at her, his expression unreadable. She could feel his gaze burrowing into her, and it made her skin crawl. Was he following her? She didn't know, but in that instant, the old voice inside her head, one that society had trained her to listen to, whispered, "What if he's dangerous?" And before she could stop herself, her fingers had already dialed the number. The 911 operator's voice was calm, professional. "What's your emergency?" I'm not sure," Margaret stammered, her voice trembling slightly. "There's a boy, a teenager. He's acting strange. He's just standing there, staring at me. I feel unsafe." The operator's voice softened. "Can you describe him for me?" Margaret swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. She didn't want to overreact, but the fear inside her was growing. "He's African American. About 15, I think. He's wearing a hoodie, and he just looks, I don't know, like he's waiting for something. I'm not sure, but it's unsettling." "Thank you. Stay on the line. We'll send someone out to check." The moment she hung up, Margaret realized her hands were shaking. What had she done? She had just called the police on a kid, a teenager, barely old enough to know how the world would judge him. And now she had set in motion something that she couldn't undo. As she turned to leave, her eyes darted back to the boy. He was still standing there, his gaze fixed on her, unmoving. The world seemed to close in around her as she walked away, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the tension she'd just ignited was only the beginning of something much darker, something she hadn't even begun to understand, and neither did he. The air felt thicker now. Margaret could feel it as she walked away from the boy, her footsteps quick and panicked, her mind racing in directions she hadn't anticipated. The weight of her decision settled heavily on her shoulders, each step amplifying the internal voice that told her she had just made a mistake, maybe even the biggest one of her life. But how could she know? How could anyone know? He looked dangerous. The rain, which had been light at first, now came down harder, as if nature itself was trying to wash away her discomfort, or perhaps punish her. Margaret barely noticed the wetness creeping up her jeans, her eyes locked on the path ahead, hoping the shadows of the park would swallow her. She needed to get home, to shut the door and lock the world outside. But she couldn't escape the image of that boy standing there, still as a statue, watching her leave. It wasn't just fear anymore, it was shame. But it was a distant kind of shame, the kind that came from knowing you had acted out of instinct, not reason, out of some primal, deep-seated impulse that you weren't quite aware you had. But when pushed to the edge, it came roaring to life. It was the fear of otherness, the unspoken divide between her and him, amplified by society's invisible lines. The kind of lines that separated people like her from people like him. Margaret reached the end of the park, almost to the street. The silence of the park behind her was unnerving, and it made her feel exposed, vulnerable. In the distance, she could already hear the wail of approaching sirens. Police. They were on their way. She couldn't believe how quickly it had all unfolded, but it was too late to turn back now. In the cold, dim-lit streets nearby, Aaron stood still, the sound of his own heartbeat the only thing he could hear. He watched Margaret's retreating figure until she disappeared from sight, the weight of the situation pressing down on him harder than the rain soaking into his hoodie. He hadn't done anything wrong, but she had looked at him with such disdain, such fear, it made him feel like a ghost in the very world he was supposed to belong to. He had been coming home from a late practice, just walking through the park to get to the bus stop. But that woman, with her tense posture and quick glance, had seen something in him that wasn't there. She had looked at him the way people looked at criminals on TV. And it stung. It stung in ways he hadn't even known were possible. "Just keep walking," he muttered to himself, pushing through the flood of emotions swirling in his chest. Anger, confusion, frustration. They were all there, fighting to get out. But there was no one to talk to, no one to express it to. His mother had taught him how to swallow it, how to stand tall in the face of this world that never truly saw him, not for who he was, but for what they assumed him to be. And it wasn't just Margaret. He knew the look she had given him, the look of someone who had already decided he was guilty, without even asking the question. She had judged him without knowing his name, without knowing his story. The rain seemed to make the world blur, a perfect reflection of the fog in his mind. Aaron didn't want trouble. He didn't want to be the focus of anyone's suspicion. But that was the reality he faced. That was the reality of being black in this city. He could be doing nothing wrong, walking down the street like anyone else. And yet there was always someone watching him, someone waiting for him to slip up. The police arrived within minutes. They were fast, but it wasn't the speed of their response that terrified Aaron. It was the way they immediately positioned themselves, like hunters. 2 squad cars slid to a stop by the park entrance, their headlights cutting through the rain. Flashing blue and red lights illuminated the space around Aaron, the stark contrast of colours casting a grotesque hue across everything in sight. The officers stepped out, their uniforms sharp and imposing. Aaron could feel his stomach tighten. He knew what was coming. He had seen it before. "Hey, kid!" The first officer, a tall man with a square jaw, shouted as he approached. His hand rested on the baton at his side, his eyes scanning Aaron with a sharpness that felt like a blade. Aaron opened his mouth to speak, to explain that he hadn't done anything, but the words caught in his throat. He could already hear the sirens in his mind, hear the growing murmur of people who had seen it all unfold. The perception of him was already being moulded, set in stone. "Hands where we can see them!" the officer barked, interrupting his thoughts. His heart skipped a beat, but he obeyed. He raised his hands slowly, palms open. This wasn't the first time he had been stopped. This wasn't the first time his existence had been reduced to a threat by people who couldn't understand the life he had to live. The second officer, shorter but stockier, stepped up beside the first, his gaze locked on Aaron, as though he were a puzzle to be solved, a puzzle that would always fit the same mold. "What are you doing here, boy?" the officer asked, his voice gruff and dismissive, the edge of disdain clearly cutting through. Aaron's throat tightened. He could feel the lump growing inside of him, choking the words that were desperate to escape. "I was just walking through the park. I live around here," he said, his voice shaking slightly. It wasn't fear, it was frustration, a deep, gnawing frustration that had been with him for years. The taller officer scoffed, eyeing Aaron as if he were a criminal waiting to be caught. Just walking? In a hoodie? At this hour? Don't think you can lie your way out of this. His voice was loaded with accusation, each syllable dripped with the certainty of guilt that wasn't his to own. I didn't do anything wrong, Aaron said, his voice gaining strength. I'm just trying to go home. You sure about that? The shorter officer sneered, stepping forward, closing the distance between them. Why don't you tell us what you were doing when you made that lady feel scared? Aaron flinched at the mention of Margaret, her fear now being used as a weapon against him. I don't know what she was scared of, he muttered, his fists balling up by his sides. I wasn't doing anything. I was just walking. The first officer's expression hardened. You're not helping your case, kid. You better watch your tone. And then, with a swift movement, the officer grabbed Aaron by the arm, jerking him forward. The sudden aggression made Aaron stumble, and he caught himself on the rain-slick pavement, his knees hitting the ground hard. His heart pounded in his chest, a sharp, painful rhythm that made it harder to breathe. The world seemed to slow as he looked up at the officers, their faces twisted in contempt. They didn't see him as a person. They didn't see a kid who had dreams, who had a mother, who wanted nothing more than to get home and out of the storm. They saw a threat that needed to be neutralized. The rain splashed against his face, the cold sting of it mingling with the heat of his own rising anger. He was tired of the same old story. The story where he never got to be the hero, where his existence was a footnote in a narrative written by others. Tired of being reduced to nothing more than a set of assumptions. The officers were dragging him up, each grip tighter than the last, each movement more forceful, as if to remind him of his place. The world was judging him without mercy, and he knew then that there was no escaping the weight of it. And Margaret, who had seen him as nothing more than a threat, would never know the truth. She would never understand the cost of the fear she had felt, the fear that had condemned him before he even spoke. The storm had only just begun. Let's take a brief pause here. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening to our stories from? Have you ever experienced something similar in your life? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this journey, consider subscribing so you don't miss what's to come. Now, let's continue. The heavy rain had soaked Aaron to the bone by the time they threw him into the back of the police car. His shirt clung to his skin, his shoes were filled with water, and his body ached from the rough handling. But the pain was nothing compared to the tightness in his chest. He wasn't just scared of what was happening. He was scared of the truth he had known all his life, but had never fully been able to accept. It didn't matter what he said, what he did, or who he was. People like him would always be seen as threats. Always. The doors slammed shut, the harsh clang of metal echoing in the stillness of the rainy night. The officers didn't speak to him, didn't explain anything. One of them sat up front. The other stared at him through the rearview mirror with an expression that seemed almost pleased. It was as if he had already written Aaron off, a mark on his record, a statistic in a system that had been designed to lock people like him away. For a moment, everything felt like it was closing in. The car's air conditioning hummed low, the steady thrum of the engine keeping time with the pounding of Aaron's heart. He wanted to scream, to shout that he was innocent, that he had done nothing, but he knew it wouldn't matter. He had been profiled, judged before even stepping foot in the park, before he even said a word. He could see the way they had looked at him, the way the officer had grabbed him so roughly, not with authority, but with the ownership of someone who had the power to destroy. And as the car sped through the rain-drenched streets, Aaron wondered if that was the point all along. To make him feel small, to make him feel less than human. Margaret had barely arrived home when she heard the police sirens in the distance, the sounds still echoing through the heavy night air. She closed the door behind her, her coat dripping on the floor, and leaned against the wall for a moment. Her hands shook as she removed her shoes. She had never expected things to go this far. She had thought she was doing the right thing, that maybe, just maybe, She had seen something that the police should know about. But as the sirens continued their relentless wail, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had set something in motion that she couldn't undo. Sitting at her kitchen table, she stared at her phone, the notification of her 911 call still open on the screen. She had tried to avoid thinking about what would happen next. She had tried to justify her actions in her mind, but it wasn't working. Every time she thought of the boy's eyes, his gaze, the way he had looked at her, she felt a cold flush of guilt rise up in her chest. What if she had made the wrong call? What if, instead of helping, she had made it worse? The phone buzzed in her hand. It was a text from her husband, asking how her walk had been. She didn't reply. Instead, she found herself opening the browser on her phone and searching for the local news. She clicked on an article about the incident at the park. It didn't take long before her stomach turned. A teenager was arrested tonight after a woman called the police, claiming he was acting suspiciously in the park. The boy, identified as 16-year-old Aaron Johnson, was detained after a brief confrontation with the police. Authorities have not yet disclosed the charges. There it was, her call, the one that had set the whole thing in motion. The boy, now a suspect who had done nothing more than walk through a park. The guilt hit her harder than the cold rain ever could. Back in the police car, Aaron tried to steady his breathing, but it was getting harder with every passing minute. The rain had subsided a bit, but the air felt thick and oppressive. He could feel his anger rising again, a heat that spread from the pit of his stomach all the way up to his chest. But what good was anger? What good was anything? He thought about his mother, and a small flicker of hope sparked within him. His mother was the head of the FBI in this region. She had power. She had influence. Surely she would know what was happening to him right now. Surely she would find out, come to his rescue, and clear all of this up. But then the reality of the situation settled in. His mother might have power, but that didn't change what the world saw when they looked at him. He was a black teenager, and to the officers in that car, he was already guilty. That was all they needed to know. That was all anyone needed to know. Aaron had lived his entire life in the shadow of that truth. He could be the smartest kid in the room, the hardest worker, the most respectful. None of it would matter. The world would always see him through the same narrow lens, as a threat. As the car pulled into the police station, Aaron couldn't help but feel a sickening wave of dread. This was it. He wasn't just going to be questioned. He was going to be treated like a criminal. Even if they couldn't charge him with anything, they would make sure he knew that he wasn't welcome in their world. They would make sure he knew his place. The officer in the front seat finally spoke, his voice breaking the heavy silence. "You think you're going to walk out of here without consequences, kid?" Aaron didn't answer. What could he say? The officer already had his mind made up, and nothing Aaron could say would change that. He was nothing more than a nuisance, an obstacle in the way of their perfect, sanitized world. The car doors opened, and Aaron was roughly shoved toward the entrance of the station. He stumbled, trying to regain his balance, but the officer's hand on his arm was firm. He was herded into a small, cold room with a metal chair and a small table. It wasn't even a proper interrogation room, just a place to sit and wait. Aaron was alone now, left with nothing but the harsh click of the door behind him, and the weight of the situation bearing down on his chest. Margaret couldn't sleep. The guilt gnawed at her, keeping her up, pulling her into a dark hole of self-doubt. She couldn't stop thinking about Aaron's face, about the way his eyes had followed her as she walked away, the way he had been forced to endure something he shouldn't have had to. She had just seen a kid, a teenager, and in her fear, she had made him an enemy. She got up from the bed, her hands trembling as she reached for her phone. She had to do something. She couldn't just sit back and pretend everything was fine. She had to find out what was really happening to him. She had to make sure she wasn't responsible for ruining his life. But when she tried to call the station, there was no answer. The lines were busy. They were too busy with the aftermath of what she had set in motion. It didn't take long before she realized that she was in over her head. She had called the police, yes, But now she was stuck in a web of consequences that she wasn't sure how to untangle. What if Aaron didn't have anyone on the outside to fight for him? What if he didn't have the voice that people like her had? What if he was left to suffer in silence, just another black kid whose life didn't matter? The truth hit her harder than any guilt she had ever felt. She wasn't just the one who had made the call. She was part of a system that wasn't built to protect him. It was built to crush him. And now she was complicit in that crushing. Vanasongi. In the holding room, Aaron sat silently, his head resting against the cold metal wall. He didn't know how long he had been there. Minutes, hours, days, it felt like. All he knew was that he was in this small room, alone, and the world outside was not kind to people like him. He had hoped for a miracle, that maybe, just maybe, someone would show up. Someone who would recognize him as a person, not a threat. But the longer he sat there, the more he realized that no one was coming. No one was going to save him, not this time. The door opened again. 2 officers stepped in. One of them had the same sneer that Aaron had seen earlier, but the other was different. Taller, cleaner, less interested in making small talk. The officer walked over to the table, sitting across from Aaron. He didn't say a word for a moment, just stared at Aaron with cold, calculating eyes. "You think you can just walk around here like you own the place?" the officer finally asked, his voice low and dangerous. Aaron didn't respond. He didn't have to. The officer leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing. "You've been a problem since the moment we saw you. We'll make sure everyone knows that." Aaron didn't flinch. He just stared back, his jaw clenched tight. Because deep down, he knew. He knew this wasn't just about him. It wasn't about this moment, this arrest, this room. It was about everything that came before, everything that would follow. And it wasn't going to stop here. The room was cold, the smell of stale coffee and old paperwork hanging in the air as the hours dragged on. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering every now and then, casting eerie shadows on the stark white walls. Aaron had long since stopped trying to keep track of time. It didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was the suffocating weight of the silence that had settled around him. The silence of being alone. Alone with his thoughts. Alone with the overwhelming realization that everything he had feared in his life had come to this. He wasn't just a boy caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was a black boy, and that was all they would ever see. Nothing else mattered. The door to the interrogation room swung open with a sharp click, and 2 officers stepped inside. One of them, the shorter officer with the condescending grin, was the one Aaron had seen earlier. The other was a new face, tall, broad-shouldered, with a stern expression that seemed to freeze the air around him. They didn't greet him or ask if he was okay. They didn't need to. They had already made up their minds. "Get up," the shorter officer said, his voice low, almost playful, as if he were enjoying the power he held over Aaron. Aaron didn't move. He was exhausted, physically, mentally, emotionally. He had been interrogated for hours, bombarded with questions he didn't have the answers to. The more he tried to explain himself, the more the officers mocked him. The more he tried to plead his innocence, the more they dismissed him as a liar, as a criminal in waiting. "I said get up." The officer's tone was harsh now, and he moved forward, his hand gripping Aaron's arm and yanking him roughly to his feet. The pain shot through Aaron's body, but he bit down on the urge to react. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. "Let him go," the tall officer said, his voice cold, but with an authority that made the shorter officer hesitate for a moment. The taller man eyed Aaron carefully, as if measuring him up like a piece of meat. Aaron had seen this before. He had seen the way people looked at him, eyes that didn't see a human being, but something less than, something that didn't belong, something to be controlled, punished, erased. The tall officer motioned for Aaron to sit, and this time, Aaron obeyed. There was no use resisting. His body ached from the rough treatment, and his mind was in a haze. The tall officer sat down across from him, the chair scraping against the concrete floor. He didn't speak immediately, his eyes fixed on Aaron, studying him. The silence between them was suffocating, and Aaron could feel his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm going to be straight with you, kid," the officer said, his voice measured and calm. "You're not walking out of here anytime soon. We've got a lot of charges we can throw at you. Disorderly conduct, resisting arrest. You're already on thin ice, and it won't take much to make sure you stay here for a long time." Aaron's stomach twisted. He had been here before, in this place. The place where no one cared about the truth. The place where no one cared about who he was. They saw the color of his skin, and that was all they needed to make their decision. "Do you understand what's happening?" the officer asked, leaning forward slightly, his gaze sharp. Aaron didn't answer. What was there to say? He knew exactly what was happening. He knew that this was how things went for people like him. It didn't matter if he was innocent. It didn't matter if he had done nothing wrong. What mattered was the narrative they had already created for him. A black teenager in the wrong place, at the wrong time. That was all they needed. The officer's eyes narrowed, as if reading his thoughts. "You don't want to make this harder on yourself. You've already been labeled as a threat, and no one is going to believe you. Not with what we've got." Aaron's heart sank. He had been here long enough to understand that the more he resisted, the more they would find ways to make his life even harder. The more they would twist his words, twist his actions, until he was just another statistic, another black boy locked up for no reason other than the fact that he existed. The shorter officer, who had been standing by the door, now stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with malice. He took a step closer to Aaron, his body looming over him. "You think you're going to get away with this? Think again, kid. You're nothing. You're just a problem we have to deal with." Aaron's fists clenched at his sides, the frustration rising like a tidal wave. He wanted to scream, to shout that he wasn't the enemy, that he wasn't the criminal they were making him out to be. But it wouldn't matter. It never did. "I don't belong here," Aaron finally said, his voice hoarse from the weight of everything that had happened. "I didn't do anything wrong." The tall officer studied him for a moment before standing up and pacing slowly across the room. "You don't belong here?" The officer chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "You belong here more than you realize. You're just another reminder of the problem we have to deal with. You're a threat, whether you like it or not. And that's not something that goes away just because you say you're innocent." The words hit Aaron like a slap to the face. It was the truth. It was the ugly, undeniable truth that he had been fighting against his entire life. He was a threat, not because of anything he had done, but because of who he was, because of the color of his skin. And no matter how hard he fought, no matter how much he proved his worth, he would always be seen as the enemy. The shorter officer leaned down close to Aaron, his breath hot against his face. "You think you're special? You think just because your mum works for the FBI you're going to get out of this? Well, guess what, kid? We don't care who your mum is. You're just another black kid trying to cause trouble. You're just another reason we have to keep people like you in check." Aaron's vision blurred with anger, his chest tightening with each word. It wasn't about his mother. It wasn't about anything he had done or hadn't done. It was about the fact that he was black, and that was all they saw. "Get him out of here," the tall officer finally said, his voice dripping with disdain. The shorter officer grabbed Aaron's arm roughly again, dragging him toward the door. The two men escorted him down a narrow hallway, past a row of empty cells, past other detainees who stared at him with that same look, empty, hollow, judgmental. It was the look of people who had been broken by the system that had already decided they were worthless, that their lives didn't matter. They pushed him into a small, cramped cell and slammed the door shut behind him. The sound echoed in the silence, a final punctuation to his existence in this place. Aaron stood in the center of the cell, his fists still clenched, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The room was cold, the concrete walls grey and unyielding. He could hear the muffled sounds of voices from the other cells, but it was all distant, as if he were underwater. This was it. This was what the world had decided for him. A cell, a label, a life reduced to a number. The door to the cell clanged shut. And Aaron stood there, alone, with nothing but his thoughts and the cold walls surrounding him. He could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him, suffocating him. He wasn't just fighting for his freedom anymore. He was fighting for his humanity, and that battle, he realized, was far from over. Meanwhile, Margaret sat at home, unable to shake the nagging feeling in her gut. The guilt was consuming her, gnawing at her until she couldn't focus on anything else. She had made a call that had led to this, led to a boy she didn't know being locked away, judged, condemned. She thought about Aaron, his face, his eyes, the way he had looked at her when she walked away. It haunted her. She had been so sure that he was a threat, so sure that her fear had justified her actions. But now, the fear wasn't just her own. It was the fear of what she had done to him. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from her husband. "What happened today? Did you hear from the police?" Margaret stared at the message, the weight of the moment sinking in. What could she say? How could she explain the terror that had consumed her when she saw Aaron, and the even deeper terror now that she realized what her actions had caused? She put the phone down and stared into the darkening sky outside her window, the storm clouds still hanging overhead. What had she done? The following morning, Aaron sat slumped on the cold concrete floor of his cell. His body felt like it had been shattered into pieces, each joint and muscle aching from the abuse he had endured. The fluorescent lights above flickered intermittently, adding to the disorienting feeling of the place. It was a world of sterile silence, broken only by the occasional sounds of distant voices from other cells, echoing in a language he could no longer understand. It was as though they were from another life, another version of himself that had never had to face this moment. The hours had dragged by in slow, excruciating seconds, and by now, Aaron had almost lost track of the time. He had been alone for what seemed like an eternity, isolated in the small, cramped cell that had become his world. Every minute felt like a lifetime. His mind raced with thoughts, each one more suffocating than the last. He thought about his mother, the woman who had always been his rock. She had taught him how to fight for what was right, how to stand up in a world that didn't want him to. But now, in this cold, concrete box, her lessons seemed distant and hollow. His mother had the power to change the world, to stop injustice in its tracks, but she couldn't protect him here. Here, he was just another black boy trapped in a system that was designed to break him. The world had always seen him as a threat, but now he was beginning to see it too. The harsh words of the officers still echoed in his mind, their disdain and cruelty still fresh in his ears. They had looked at him like he was nothing, like his life didn't matter. And maybe they were right. Maybe in their eyes, he was just another statistic, another cog in the wheel of a system built to maintain control over people like him. He could feel the weight of that thought settling heavily on his chest, suffocating him. But it was also the truth. And truth, no matter how painful, was still something he had to face. And Margaret couldn't sleep. The events of the previous day were still swirling in her mind, a storm of guilt and regret that she couldn't escape. The weight of her decision, the phone call that had set everything into motion, was suffocating her. She had thought she was doing the right thing, but now, in the stillness of her empty house, she wasn't so sure. She had tried to convince herself that she had been justified, that her fear had been reasonable. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that it had been her fear that had condemned Aaron. It hadn't been his actions, his behavior, it had been his skin. She had judged him without knowing anything about him, and she had allowed that judgment to decide his fate. She couldn't stop thinking about the look on his face when she walked away, the way his eyes had followed her as if pleading for understanding. She had been too scared, too focused on the idea of danger, to see him as a human being. And now, the reality of what she had done was sinking in. She had called the police on a kid who hadn't done anything wrong, just because he looked out of place to her, just because he was black. The shame settled over her like a heavy blanket. How could she have let herself be so blinded by fear? How could she have been so easily manipulated by the very system that had taught her to distrust people like Aaron? Margaret stood up from the couch, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and guilt. She had to do something. She had to make it right. But what could she do? What if it was already too late? Back at the station, things had only gotten worse for Aaron. The officers had come and gone, their faces cold and indifferent. They had thrown a few questions at him, questions that didn't make sense, questions that weren't even relevant to the situation. They didn't want answers, they wanted confessions. They wanted to break him. Aaron had refused to answer them. Every time they asked him something, he stayed silent, knowing that anything he said would only be used against him. He had been taught how to stay quiet in situations like this, how to protect himself from the words that could trap him. But silence wasn't enough. Silence didn't protect him from the hate that oozed from every corner of this place. The officers had grown frustrated with him. They didn't like his defiance. They didn't like the fact that he wasn't cooperating. They wanted to break him, to make him submit to their version of the truth. The tall officer, the one who had seemed so calm and controlled when he first entered the room, was now pacing back and forth in front of Aaron. His voice was low, but it carried a weight of authority that made Aaron's skin crawl. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," the officer said, his voice tinged with impatience. "We've already got enough evidence to make sure you stay locked up for a long time. You're not going anywhere, so why don't you just save yourself the trouble and tell us the truth?" Aaron stayed silent, his fists clenched at his sides. The officer's words were like nails on a chalkboard, scraping away at the last bit of resistance he had left. "You're not special, kid," the officer continued, his voice growing darker. "You're not some innocent kid caught up in something he didn't do. You're just another black teenager in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that's not something the world will ever forgive you for." The words hit Aaron like a punch to the gut. He had heard this all before, the same tired rhetoric that was used to justify the mistreatment of people like him. He had heard it on the streets, in the schools, on the news. It was always the same. Black people were the problem. They were the ones who needed to be controlled, to be feared, to be punished. But Aaron wasn't ready to let them win. He wasn't ready to accept the lie that he was nothing more than a statistic, a criminal in waiting. "I didn't do anything wrong," Aaron said finally, his voice low but steady. "I didn't hurt anyone. I didn't break any laws. I was just walking through the park." The officer stopped pacing and turned to face him, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. "You really think anyone's going to believe that?" the officer said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're just another thug with a hoodie. You think people are going to give you the benefit of the doubt? No, they see you for what you are, and what you are is a problem." Aaron stood up, his legs shaking with the effort, but he refused to back down. He was done being afraid. He was done letting people like this define him. "I'm not a problem," Aaron said, his voice growing louder. "I'm a human being. I'm just like you." The officer stepped forward, his face inches from Aaron's. "No, you're not like me," he sneered. "You'll never be like me. You're just a threat, and that's all you'll ever be." The officer turned and walked out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Aaron stood there, shaking with rage, but he refused to let it consume him. He wouldn't let them win. Not this time. And meanwhile, Margaret was struggling with the weight of her own guilt. She couldn't ignore the truth anymore. She had made a mistake, a terrible mistake, and now someone she didn't even know, was paying the price for her fear. She had been so quick to judge Aaron, so quick to assume that he was dangerous simply because of the color of his skin. And now, the consequences of that judgment were clear. She had helped put him behind bars, and no amount of regret would change that. But she had to try. She had to make it right. Margaret picked up her phone and dialed the number for the police station. Her hands were shaking, but she pressed on, hoping against hope that someone on the other end would listen. It took a few moments before someone answered. "Hello, this is Officer Harris. How can I help you?" I need to speak with someone about the boy you arrested yesterday," Margaret said, her voice tight with emotion. "His name is Aaron Johnson. He's the one I called about." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Margaret could hear the sound of papers rustling in the background. "I'm afraid there's not much I can tell you, ma'am," Officer Harris said finally. "He's being processed. He's been charged with several offences." "Please," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "I need to know what's happening to him. I made a mistake. I shouldn't have called the police on him. He didn't deserve this." There was another pause, and then Officer Harris spoke again, his tone more serious. "I understand, ma'am, but I can't promise anything. If you want to help him, you'll have to contact his lawyer." Margaret's heart sank. She didn't know what to do, how to fix this. She had opened the door to this nightmare, and now she didn't know how to close it. But one thing was clear. She wasn't going to sit idly by and let Aaron suffer because of her mistake. She would do whatever it took to make things right, even if it meant going up against the very system that had condemned him in the first place. She took a deep breath and made a vow to herself. She wouldn't stop until Aaron was free, until he had the chance to live a life without fear, without the constant weight of judgment and prejudice that had been placed on him the moment he was born. The days bled together in the holding cell, each one stretched out longer than the last, filled with thoughts and frustrations that Aaron couldn't escape. His body was growing numb from the cold of the concrete and the dampness in the air. The thin blanket they gave him was no comfort. It was barely enough to stave off the chill that seemed to seep into his bones. But it was the isolation that hurt the most. There were no visitors, no calls, just the sporadic, harsh visits from the officers who treated him like he wasn't even human, just another black kid who had found himself on the wrong side of the law. They looked at him with that same dismissive expression, as if his entire existence was a disruption to their perfect, orderly world. They didn't care who he was or where he came from. All they saw was a threat, a criminal, a danger to their society. Every time they came in, they spoke to him like he was less than nothing. "Still here, huh?" one of the officers had said, a sarcastic grin spreading across his face as he leaned against the doorframe. "You better get used to this place, kid. This is where people like you belong." Aaron had bitten back the urge to retort. He knew that anything he said would only feed their hunger for cruelty. They had already decided who he was, and no amount of arguing would change their minds. He had learned quickly that his words didn't matter, at least, not to them. The officers didn't see a person standing in front of them. They saw a stereotype. They saw someone who was already guilty, no matter the truth. And the truth didn't matter, not when he had already been written off. On the other side of the city, Margaret sat in her car, her knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel. She had spent the last few days trying to track down a lawyer who would take Aaron's case, but the more she tried, the more obstacles she ran into. Every call she made seemed to hit a dead end. The public defenders she reached out to were too overwhelmed to take on another case, and those who might have been willing were too afraid to get involved with something as politically charged as this. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at it, her heart skipping a beat. It was a message from her husband. "Have you heard anything yet? Are we really going to let this go on for much longer?" Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She had been trying to avoid this conversation with him, but it was impossible to ignore any longer. She couldn't sit back and pretend that everything was fine. She had made a terrible mistake, and she had to fix it. She typed out a response, her hands shaking as she tried to put her thoughts into words. "I'm doing everything I can, but it's harder than I thought. The system is stacked against him. And I—" She paused, her fingers hovering over the keys. She didn't know how to finish. She didn't know how to explain that she was fighting against something bigger than herself, something that couldn't be fixed with just a phone call or a simple apology. Before she could finish typing, the phone buzzed again. It was a call this time, and when she saw the name on the screen, her stomach dropped. It was her friend, Linda, someone she had known for years. Linda worked as an investigative journalist, and over the years, she had seen the underbelly of the system. Margaret picked up the phone, hoping for something, anything that could give her a sense of direction. "Margaret, we need to talk," Linda's voice came through the line, tense and urgent. "I've been looking into Aaron Johnson's case. The way it's being handled, it's all wrong." Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as she listened. "What do you mean? What's happening to him?" "The system is already set up to bury him," Linda said. "The officers involved have already planted the narrative. They've made it clear that they see him as a threat. And now it's about making sure the charges stick. If they can't get him on one thing, they'll get him on something else. It's a cycle they've perfected." Margaret felt her stomach churn. I know it's all wrong, but I don't know how to stop it. They've already decided. I'm just one person. How can I make a difference when the system is already rigged against him?" Linda's voice softened. "You can make a difference, but it's going to take more than just you. You're going to have to bring in the right people. You need to make this story public, Margaret. You need to expose the way they're treating him. People need to know what's going on." Margaret felt a lump form in her throat. She had never been one to seek the spotlight, but Linda was right. This wasn't about just Aaron anymore. It was about exposing the system that had been crushing people like him for years. "I'll do whatever it takes," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know you will," Linda replied. "But it's going to take more than good intentions. This is going to get ugly. They won't back down easily." "I don't care," Margaret said, her voice gaining strength. "I can't live with myself if I don't try. I have to make this right." Back in the holding cell, Aaron had reached the breaking point. He had spent the past few days in a fog, not sure how to fight back, not sure if there was even a way to fight. The officers had stopped trying to get answers from him. They were done with the questioning. Now, it was just about keeping him locked up, making sure he understood his place. But Aaron was done being silent. The door to the cell swung open with a metallic screech, and one of the officers stepped inside. Aaron stood up slowly, his body stiff from the long hours of sitting, but his eyes never left the officer's face. The officer smirked at him, as if enjoying the power he held over the young man. "Feeling sorry for yourself?" the officer sneered. "You should be. You're not getting out of here anytime soon. This is where you belong, kid. People like you always find their way here eventually." Aaron clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He had heard this before. He had heard it all his life. "People like me," he muttered, the words bitter in his mouth. "Yeah, I know. You don't see me as a person, do you? You don't see anything but my skin. You don't see what's inside." The officer's grin faded for a moment, replaced by an expression of disdain. "You don't get it, do you? You don't belong in the world we've built. You're just another problem we have to fix. And you'll never be anything more than that." Aaron took a deep breath, feeling the heat of his anger rise. But this time, he didn't back down. "I am something more. And I'm not going to let people like you define me. You don't control me." The officer's hand shot out, grabbing Aaron by the collar and slamming him against the wall. The rough contact made Aaron's head spin, but he refused to let himself go down. He couldn't afford to. Not now. "You really think you have a choice?" the officer hissed, his breath hot against Aaron's face. "You're just a kid. You don't know anything about the real world, and you never will." Aaron's heart was racing, but he held his ground. He didn't flinch. He wasn't going to let this man take everything from him. He wasn't going to let anyone take his dignity. "You don't own me," Aaron said, his voice steady. "You can't break me." The officer's grip tightened, but just as quickly, he released him, shoving Aaron to the ground before storming out of the cell. Aaron lay there for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest, his body aching from the struggle. But in that moment, something shifted inside him. He wasn't going to let this define him. He wasn't going to let them win. He was going to fight back, no matter what it took. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, a stack of legal papers in front of her. The weight of the task ahead was heavy, but it was also a call to action. She had reached out to Linda, and now they were working together to expose the truth. It was time to shine a light on the darkness, to make sure that Aaron's story didn't fade into the background like so many others. She wasn't just fighting for him anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced, for everyone who had ever been written off as less than. This wasn't just about one boy. It was about dismantling the system that had allowed this kind of injustice to thrive. Margaret's phone buzzed on the table, snapping her back to reality. It was a message from Linda. "We have a meeting with the press tomorrow. It's time to take this public. No turning back now." Margaret took a deep breath, a sense of resolve settling over her. She couldn't undo the damage she had done, but she could help make sure it never happened again. She was ready to fight. The room was cold, but the heat of the day had long since settled into the back of Aaron's mind. What mattered now was the pounding in his chest, the way his breath came in shallow bursts. He had spent so many days confined to this space that the concept of time had become something elusive, something out of reach. His body was tired, but his mind was alive, filled with thoughts that refused to stop spinning. The longer he stayed here, the more his thoughts focused on one undeniable truth. He was being erased. Aaron had never felt so invisible in his life. He had always been told that if he worked hard enough, if he stayed out of trouble, he would succeed. That was the lie they fed him. It didn't matter how hard he tried. It didn't matter that he had never broken the law, that he had never caused harm to anyone. He wasn't given the benefit of the doubt. He wasn't allowed the luxury of being seen as innocent. The officers had made sure of that. Every time they came in, they saw him not as a human, not as a teenager, but as a symbol, a black body in a system that was designed to keep him down. They had locked him up, treated him like an animal in a cage, and now they were preparing to make an example of him. They wanted to show the world that people like him, people from his neighborhood, from his background, were always a threat, no matter what they did. But Aaron was tired of being the enemy. He was tired of fighting a war he never signed up for, a war that was being waged against him simply because of the color of his skin. The door to his cell swung open once again, the harsh light from the hallway flooding in. For a brief moment, Aaron felt his stomach tighten, but he quickly steeled himself. He was done showing fear. He had nothing left to lose. The officer who entered this time was different, calmer, more controlled. Aaron didn't recognize him, but the man's eyes were sharp, calculating. He stepped into the cell with a slow, measured pace, and for a moment he just stood there, observing Aaron like a predator sizing up its prey. "You're still here," the officer said, his voice steady, almost too calm. It was as if he were trying to gauge Aaron's reaction. Aaron remained silent, his eyes locked on the officer's face, refusing to show any weakness. He had learned long ago that silence was sometimes the only defense he had. The officer didn't seem to mind the silence. Instead, he pulled out a chair and sat down across from Aaron, his eyes never leaving him. "You know," he began, "I've been looking at your file. Seems like you've had a run-in with the law before. Nothing serious, but still, it's enough for people to start wondering about your character." Aaron's jaw clenched, and he bit back the words that threatened to spill out. He had been here long enough to know the drill. They didn't care about his character. They didn't care about his family, his dreams, his future. They cared about his skin. They saw it as a threat. "You've been here for a while now," the officer continued, his voice almost soothing. "You've had plenty of time to think about it, about what happens next." Aaron's fist tightened. He wasn't sure where the officer was going with this, but he didn't trust him. He knew the game. They would break him down, make him doubt himself, make him feel small. They had been doing it for years. "I don't need to think about it," Aaron said finally, his voice low but steady. "I didn't do anything wrong. I'm not guilty." The officer's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was a smile that sent chills down Aaron's spine. "Of course you didn't. But that's the thing, isn't it? You don't have to do anything wrong to be seen as guilty. People like you, they're already marked before they even open their mouths." Aaron felt a surge of anger, but he held it back. It wasn't worth it. The officer was trying to provoke him, to get him to lash out. If he gave in, he would be playing right into their hands. "You're just another black kid in the wrong place at the wrong time," the officer continued, his words cutting through Aaron like a knife. "And no matter how much you deny it, No matter how much you say you didn't do anything wrong, the world doesn't care. They'll never care. They'll always see you as a threat. Aaron's heart pounded in his chest, the officer's words sinking into him like a heavy weight. He wanted to fight back, to yell, to scream that this wasn't fair, that he wasn't a criminal, but he knew it wouldn't matter. No one would listen. The system was rigged, and he was just another victim of it. But then, something inside him shifted. He wasn't going to let them define him. Not anymore. They could say whatever they wanted. They could accuse him of being a threat, of being guilty without proof, but they couldn't take away his humanity. "I'm not what you say I am," Aaron said, his voice growing stronger, more defiant. "You can't make me into something I'm not. You can try, but you won't succeed." The officer's smile faded, and for the first time, Aaron saw a flicker of something else in his eyes. Something like uncertainty, like the officer wasn't as sure of himself as he had been before. But it didn't last. The officer stood up, his posture stiff. He didn't say anything else, just turned on his heel and walked out of the cell, slamming the door behind him. The heavy click of the lock echoed in the silence, and Aaron was left standing there, his heart still racing, but his mind clearer than it had been in days. He wasn't going to let them win. He wasn't going to let them define who he was. He would find a way to fight back, no matter what it took. Back in the outside world, Margaret was sitting at her kitchen table, papers scattered across it, her phone resting beside her. She had made countless calls in the past few days, and every call had led her to a dead end. The lawyers she had reached out to were either too busy, too afraid, or too unwilling to take on Aaron's case. It was as if the entire system had conspired to keep him locked up and forgotten. But Margaret couldn't stop now. She had to do something. She'd already set things in motion, and there was no turning back. She had made a mistake, but she was determined to make it right. Her phone buzzed, and she picked it up quickly, her heart leaping in her chest when she saw that it was Linda calling. Margaret answered immediately. "Margaret," Linda's voice came through, urgent. "You're not going to believe this. I've been digging into Aaron's case, and I found something huge." Margaret sat up straighter, her pulse quickening. "What is it? What did you find?" "It's the officers involved," Linda said, her voice tight with excitement. "I've got sources who've confirmed that one of them has a history of racial profiling. They've been involved in similar cases before, cases where they targeted black teenagers and made sure the charges stuck, no matter what. This isn't just about Aaron. This is part of a much bigger problem." Margaret felt a cold shiver run down her spine. This wasn't just about one boy. This was part of a pattern, a system that had been punishing people like Aaron for years, and no one had been willing to speak out. "What do we do?" Margaret asked, her voice shaking. "What can we do?" "We make this public," Linda said. "We expose the system for what it is. We show the world what's really going on, and we don't stop until Aaron is free." Margaret felt a surge of determination fill her. She had been afraid, unsure of what to do, but now she knew. This wasn't just about Aaron anymore. It was about justice. It was about making sure that no one else had to suffer like this. "I'm in," Margaret said, her voice steady. "Let's do this." Back in the holding cell, Aaron stood by the small window, staring out at the world he could no longer reach. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if he would ever get out of here. But one thing was certain, he wasn't going to stop fighting. He wasn't going to let the world decide his fate, not like this. And as the days passed, and the news began to spread, Aaron could feel the shift. The weight of the world had always been on his shoulders, but now, the tide was beginning to turn. People were starting to listen. People were starting to see the truth. He wasn't just a statistic. He wasn't just another black boy caught in a broken system. He was Aaron Johnson, and he was going to fight for his life. The courtroom was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The silence felt like a pressure, a weight that pressed down on Aaron's chest with every passing second. His eyes were fixed on the front of the room, where the judge sat, stern and emotionless, while his defense attorney reviewed their case notes in hushed tones. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and the cold, sterile scent of the courthouse. But for Aaron, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the feeling in his gut, the gnawing, suffocating feeling that this moment, this fight, would decide his future. Aaron was no stranger to injustice. His entire life had been shaped by it. He had learned to navigate the world with caution, to understand that the color of his skin would always be the first thing people noticed, long before they saw who he truly was. His past was a mosaic of microaggressions, insults, and the constant pressure of being viewed as less than. But none of that had prepared him for the nightmare that had become his reality in the last few weeks. He had been arrested for nothing more than walking through a park, a simple act that had somehow turned into an accusation, a case, a fight for his life. And now, sitting in the courtroom, he understood the stakes. This wasn't just about his freedom. It was about making sure the world saw him for who he was. A teenager with hopes, with dreams, with a future, not just another black boy whose life didn't matter. Beside him, his attorney, a tall, thin man named Richard Montgomery, was doing his best to mask the nervous energy that seemed to radiate from him. Montgomery wasn't the most experienced lawyer. In fact, this was one of his first high-profile cases. But he had something that Aaron could respect, a genuine belief in justice, in right and wrong. Montgomery shuffled his papers before looking at Aaron with a reassuring nod. "We've got this," he said softly. But even with that promise, Aaron could hear the doubt in his voice. The room filled with murmurs as the prosecutor, a tall, broad-shouldered man named Kenneth Blake, stepped forward. Blake was polished, confident, the kind of man who exuded power. He was the type of prosecutor who had built a career on cases just like Aaron's. Cases where the facts didn't matter as much as the narrative, where the outcome was predetermined by the biases of a system that had long since stopped listening to the truth. Blake's eyes briefly flicked toward Aaron, and for a split second, Aaron could almost hear the sneer in his gaze. To Blake, Aaron was just another statistic, another number in a system that had always favored people like him over people like Aaron. He wasn't a person. He wasn't a young man with dreams and aspirations. He was a threat. The trial proceeded with the usual formalities, each side presenting their arguments. The defense painted Aaron as a victim of racial profiling, a young man who had done nothing wrong but had been targeted simply because of the color of his skin. They presented witnesses who testified about how the police had a history of stopping and frisking black youth in the area, how Aaron had been unfairly treated, how the arrest had been an overreaction to a harmless situation. But Blake wasn't interested in the truth. His job wasn't to uncover the facts. His job was to secure a conviction. And so, he twisted the narrative. He painted Aaron as a troublemaker, as someone who had provoked the situation by acting suspiciously. He pulled out statements from the officers involved, claiming that Aaron had been belligerent and uncooperative, that he had resisted arrest. It didn't matter that the officers had no evidence to back up their claims. It didn't matter that their testimonies were full of holes. To Blake, Aaron was just another example of a young black man who couldn't be trusted, someone who was bound to break the law sooner or later. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Blake said, his voice smooth and convincing, "we are not here to judge whether or not Aaron Johnson is guilty of a crime. We are here to determine whether his behavior on the night of his arrest is a reflection of the kind of person he is. A person who refuses to comply with authority, a person who disregards the law, and a person who, if left unchecked, could become a danger to society." The words hit Aaron like a slap in the face. He wasn't a person. He was a danger to society. That's how they saw him. That's how they would always see him. He was never going to be anything more than the stereotype they had created for him. No matter how hard he fought, no matter how much evidence there was to prove his innocence, the world would always look at him and see a threat. But as the prosecutor spoke, something inside Aaron clicked. He couldn't just sit back and let them do this to him. He couldn't let them define him. He wasn't just a label. He was a human being. And he would not let this system break him. When the time came for Aaron to take the stand, he didn't hesitate. He stood up, his legs shaky, but his resolve firm. Montgomery gave him an encouraging nod, but Aaron didn't look at him. He wasn't here for Montgomery. He was here for himself. As he walked to the witness stand, Aaron felt every eye in the room on him. He could feel the weight of their judgment, the weight of their assumptions pressing down on him. He sat down, the chair creaking beneath him, and waited for the questions to come. Blake was the first to speak, his voice dripping with condescension. "Aaron, you've heard the charges against you. You've heard the accusations made by the officers. You've heard what they say about you. You've been arrested for resisting arrest, for disorderly conduct. How do you explain your behavior that night?" Aaron swallowed hard. He could feel his heart racing in his chest, but he didn't let it show. He knew what he had to say. He had to say the truth, the whole truth. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said, his voice steady. "I was just walking through the park on my way home. I didn't say anything to anyone. I didn't do anything that would give them a reason to stop me." Blake leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "So you're telling us that you did nothing to provoke the situation? You're telling us that when the officers approached you, you didn't act suspiciously?" "I didn't act suspiciously," Aaron said, shaking his head. "I was just walking. I wasn't doing anything wrong." Blake smirked, clearly trying to undermine Aaron's testimony. "So you expect us to believe that the officers had no reason to stop you, that they just decided to target you for no reason?" Aaron took a deep breath. He had heard this before. He had heard people ask him to prove his innocence, to justify his existence. But he wasn't going to play that game. Not anymore. "They stopped me because I'm black," Aaron said, his voice strong, but tinged with the exhaustion of years of fighting for the same basic human decency. "I wasn't doing anything wrong. They stopped me because of the way I looked, because of the way I was dressed, because of the color of my skin." There was a moment of stunned silence in the courtroom. Blake's confident demeanor faltered for a second, and even the jury seemed to shift in their seats. Aaron had said the one thing that everyone in that room had been avoiding: the truth. Blake recovered quickly, however, and leaned back in his chair, his expression a mask of disdain. "That's quite the accusation, Aaron. But we have evidence here that suggests you were confrontational. You didn't cooperate when the officers told you to stop. You resisted arrest." "I wasn't confrontational," Aaron responded, his voice steady. "I was scared. I didn't know why they were stopping me. I didn't know what was going to happen next. I didn't know if they were going to hurt me, or worse." Blake scoffed, clearly dismissing Aaron's words. "So you expect us to believe that the officers were just out to get you, that they were out to hurt you?" "Yes," Aaron said, his eyes locked on Blake's. "I do, because that's the reality for people like me. The officers don't see us as people. They see us as threats. And no matter what we do, no matter how we try to be good, to be law-abiding, it's never enough. We're always the enemy." The words hung in the air like a challenge, daring anyone in the room to argue. And for the first time since this whole ordeal began, Aaron felt like he had control. He wasn't just sitting back, waiting for someone else to speak for him. He wasn't just a passive participant in a system that had already decided his fate. He was standing up for himself, for his dignity, for his humanity. Blake, seemingly rattled, dismissed him with a sharp wave of his hand, clearly not willing to entertain this line of questioning any longer. But Aaron didn't care. He had said what needed to be said. As he walked back to his seat, he could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him. But this time, he didn't look away. He held his head high, his chest out, knowing that he had finally found his voice. But then outside the courthouse, the news vans were already gathering. The story of a young black man standing up against a corrupt system was beginning to go viral. Margaret stood on the steps of the courthouse, her heart pounding with anticipation. She had done everything she could to bring this to light. Now, it was up to the world to decide. The moment she saw Aaron walk out of the courthouse, her heart swelled with pride. He had stood his ground. He had spoken his truth. No matter what happened next, he had won. And so had she. The days after the trial had been a whirlwind for Aaron. He had walked out of that courtroom, his head held high, but the weight of everything that had happened still pressed down on him. The trial had been a victory of sorts. He had spoken the truth, and he had been heard. But the battle was far from over. The system that had held him in its grip for so long was not one to relinquish control so easily. The world was watching, but so was the system. And now Aaron knew better than ever that standing up meant putting everything on the line. For Aaron, the taste of freedom was bittersweet. As the press had swarmed him after the trial, he had been bombarded with questions that felt more like an interrogation than an inquiry. The cameras flashed, the microphones were thrust in his face, but none of it seemed to matter. He had spoken his truth in that courtroom, but the world outside was a different story. They wanted the narrative they had already created for him, a narrative of guilt, of danger, of a black teenager who didn't know his place. "Do you feel vindicated?" one reporter had asked, their voice sharp and eager, as if they were waiting for Aaron to give them the answer they had already scripted. Aaron had stood there, numb to the questions, the flashing cameras, the probing voices. His mind was on the one thing that had truly mattered to him, the truth he had spoken. But now, outside the courtroom, he was realizing just how much more it cost to speak that truth. His world had changed, but it hadn't changed for the better. It had shifted into something new, something more complicated, and the weight of it was suffocating. Margaret had been there too, standing on the steps with him, watching as the media swarmed around. She had felt a wave of pride for Aaron, but it was quickly overshadowed by the nagging guilt that had been eating at her for days. This was her fault. She had set this entire nightmare in motion, and now, as she watched Aaron try to navigate the aftermath of the trial, she felt a deep sense of responsibility. She couldn't undo what she had done, but she could try to make sure that he wasn't left to face the consequences alone. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Linda. "We need to talk. There's something you should know about the backlash. It's already started." Margaret's stomach twisted. She had known that the victory in the courtroom wasn't going to be the end of the battle. She had seen it in the eyes of the jury, in the faces of the officers, in the way they had treated Aaron from the moment he had been arrested. But she hadn't expected this. She quickly typed a response, her fingers trembling. "What do you mean? What's happening?" Linda's response came almost immediately. "The press is spinning this in a way that's going to make things worse for Aaron. They're framing him as a troublemaker, someone who is stirring up division. The story they want to tell is that Aaron's case is just one more example of the system bending over backward for these people. They're using his case to inflame tensions, to push their own agenda." Margaret's heart sank. This wasn't just about Aaron anymore. This wasn't just about him speaking his truth in court. This was about the narrative that would shape how the world viewed him from now on. The truth he had spoken was being twisted, spun into something ugly, something that would further alienate him from the very system he was trying to challenge. She could feel the weight of the words. "What do we do?" "Hold tight," Linda replied. "I've got a few things in motion. We're going to need to go public with everything we know about the officers involved. We need to expose them for what they are. This isn't just about Aaron anymore. This is bigger than him." Margaret stared at her phone, feeling a deep sense of dread settle in her chest. The battle was far from over, and it was going to be harder than anything she had ever imagined. Aaron, for his part, was trying to stay focused. He had learned long ago that the best way to survive was to keep your head down, to avoid drawing attention. But now, after everything that had happened, he couldn't afford to keep his head down anymore. He had fought for his life in that courtroom, but he knew that the fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. He had been walking home from his lawyer's office when the first message hit him. It was from a number he didn't recognize. He hesitated before opening it, but curiosity won out. "You're nothing but a troublemaker. The system doesn't need to bend for people like you. You're a threat, and everyone knows it. The words stung, but they weren't new. They were just the latest in a string of threats and insults he had received ever since the trial. The world was angry at him, angry for standing up, angry for not staying silent, and he could feel that anger, an anger that was being stoked by the media, by the system that had tried so hard to suppress him. The next few days were a blur of hostile media coverage, anonymous threats, and a growing sense of isolation. The media didn't portray him as a hero. They didn't portray him as a victim. They portrayed him as a villain. The narrative they were building was one of defiance, of rebellion against authority, as though he had brought this on himself by speaking the truth. But Aaron refused to back down. It was a few days later, as the news coverage began to intensify, that Margaret received an alarming phone call from Linda. "You need to hear this," Linda said, her voice grim. "There's been a development. I've been talking to some sources, and I've uncovered something that could change everything for Aaron. It's about the officers involved in his arrest." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. "What is it?" "I'm sending you the files," Linda said. "There's evidence that suggests one of the officers had a history of racial profiling. He's been involved in several cases where black individuals were arrested without cause. This is bigger than just Aaron's case. This is systemic." Margaret swallowed hard, the weight of the revelation sinking in. This was more than just a single bad officer. This was a pattern, a deeply entrenched problem within the system that had allowed these officers to operate with impunity. The truth was uglier than she had imagined. And the more she learned, the more she realized just how deeply broken everything was. "I'll get this to Aaron's lawyer," Margaret said, her voice tight with determination. "We need to expose this. We need to make sure everyone knows what's really going on." The next few weeks were a blur of press conferences, public statements, and growing unrest. As the truth about the officers involved in Aaron's arrest began to surface, the media shifted its focus. No longer were they portraying Aaron as the villain. Now, they were beginning to see him for what he truly was, a victim of a system that had been broken long before his case had even begun. But the backlash was swift. The system was not one to back down easily. The police union began to rally behind the officers, using their influence to discredit the evidence, to frame Aaron's case as one of simple misunderstanding, not systemic racism. The media, despite the mounting evidence, continued to churn out stories that leaned toward defending the officers. They painted the truth as a conspiracy, a distortion of reality aimed at undermining law enforcement. Aaron watched as the world continued to try and rewrite his story, but he wasn't going to let them. One evening, as Aaron sat in his apartment, scrolling through the headlines, he received another message, this time from his mother. "It's time, Aaron. The world is listening, but we need to make sure they understand. You're not just a headline. You're not just a case. You're a human being, and it's time for everyone to see that." Aaron read the words, his heart swelling with pride. His mother had always been his rock, always reminded him that his value wasn't determined by what others thought of him. And now, more than ever, Aaron realized that he couldn't let the world define him. He had to define himself. That night, as he stood on his balcony, looking out over the city, he made a decision. He wasn't going to let the system swallow him whole. He wasn't going to let them use his story as a tool to perpetuate their own agenda. He was going to take control of his narrative, and he was going to make sure the world knew the truth. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The days leading up to the final decision felt like an eternity for Aaron. The weight of the world seemed to rest on his shoulders, and as he walked into the courthouse one last time, he could feel the eyes of everyone on him. The crowd gathered outside. The protesters, the reporters, the curious onlookers had turned the trial into a spectacle. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about what he represented, a symbol of resistance, of the fight for justice, and perhaps for some, a symbol of division. But Aaron knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to be silenced again. Not now. Not ever. The system had tried to break him, but it had failed. It had pushed him to the edge, to the point where he had to decide, Would he let it crush him? Or would he stand tall and fight back? He stood in front of the courthouse, watching as the world around him buzzed with tension. And he knew the answer. He had made it through this storm, and no matter what happened in this final moment, he had already won. Inside the courthouse, the tension was palpable. The jury had been deliberating for hours. Aaron's lawyer, Richard Montgomery, stood by him, speaking in low tones about the importance of maintaining hope, about how the truth had been made clear in the courtroom. Margaret, too, was there, sitting in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had spent weeks working tirelessly to bring everything to light, to make sure that Aaron's story was heard. But now, as she looked at Aaron, she couldn't help but feel a deep, gnawing sense of worry. She had never been more afraid in her life. What if they failed him? What if all their hard work, all their sacrifices, was for nothing? The door to the courtroom opened, and the bailiff called the jury back in. A hush fell over the room as the 12 people entered and took their seats. The judge, a woman with sharp, focused eyes, motioned for the proceedings to begin. Aaron took a deep breath as he sat at the defendant's table, his eyes fixed on the jury. The moment he had feared for so long had arrived, the moment where his future, his freedom, was out of his hands. Outside the courthouse, the protesters had only grown louder as the day went on. People from all walks of life had gathered, holding signs that called for justice, that demanded accountability, that shouted out the truth. It was a cacophony of voices, each one hoping that today would be the day when the system would finally hear them. Margaret stood outside for a moment, her heart heavy. She looked around at the crowd, the black faces, the white faces, the young and the old, all united in this cause. It had started with one phone call, one moment of fear, but it had turned into something much larger, something that had sparked a fire that could not be put out. She remembered the first time she had heard Aaron's voice, the way he had spoken in that courtroom about the injustice he had endured, how he had fought to be seen as human. The weight of his words still echoed in her mind. He wasn't just a boy on trial. He was the voice of so many others who had been silenced for far too long. Back in the courtroom, the silence was deafening. The judge motioned for the jury to present their verdict. The foreperson stood, and with the eyes of the entire room fixed on her, she spoke the words that would determine the course of Aaron's life. We, the jury, find the defendant, Aaron Johnson, not guilty. The words seemed to hang in the air, suspended for a moment, before crashing down with a force that left Aaron stunned. His body trembled as the weight of the decision hit him. Not guilty. He had been given a chance, a future. But at that moment, it wasn't just a victory for him. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been falsely accused, who had ever been discriminated against, who had ever been treated as less than human because of the color of their skin. Tears sprang to Aaron's eyes, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to breathe, to release the tension that had been coiled so tightly in his chest. He looked over at Margaret, whose eyes were glistening with tears of her own. She was there. She had helped him get to this moment, and now they had done it. The fight wasn't over, but this was a victory they could hold on to. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted in cheers. The air was thick with emotion as people hugged, cried, and shouted in joy. The signs that had once read, "Justice for Aaron," now proudly proclaimed, "Justice won." But amid the celebration, there were voices that were quieter, more subdued. Not everyone was celebrating. Not everyone saw the victory the way Aaron did. Not everyone saw the truth. There were still whispers, still the same voices that had called Aaron a troublemaker, a danger. There would always be people who would not understand. There would always be people who would look at Aaron and see only his skin, his race, and not the person he truly was. They would try to erase the truth. They would try to spin it, twist it into something it wasn't. But Aaron didn't care, because he knew the truth now. He had fought for it, had stood up to the weight of the world that tried to crush him, and had emerged victorious. He had proved that his life mattered, and as he stood there, amid the cheers, surrounded by people who had supported him, he understood something deeply. Victory wasn't just about the outcome of this trial. It was about the journey. It was about the people who stood by him, the truth he had spoken, and the way he had fought, not just for his own life, but for the lives of others who had been silenced. The days that followed were filled with a sense of disbelief, as Aaron and Margaret worked together to share the truth of his case with the world. They were invited to speak at rallies, to tell their story, and to continue shining a light on the systemic racism that had been at the heart of Aaron's arrest. But even as they gained support, even as they saw the changes that were beginning to take place, the battle was far from over. There were still voices who tried to undermine the victory, who tried to discredit Aaron's case, who tried to rewrite the narrative. But Aaron was no longer afraid of what they would say. He had been through the storm. He had walked through the fire and come out on the other side, and now he would fight for the truth, for the people who had been pushed aside, for those whose voices had been silenced by a broken system. He would not be quiet. He would not be erased. This was only the beginning. As Aaron walked through the streets, with his head held high and his heart full of pride, he understood something in his bones. The world was changing. The fight for justice wasn't over, but it had started with him. It had started with his voice. And that voice would not be silenced again. The truth had been revealed. And no matter how hard they tried, no matter how many people tried to tear it down, the truth would remain. Thank you for following this story until the end. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What did you think of Aaron's journey and the themes in this story? Have you ever faced racism or injustice in your own life? Your experiences and insights are incredibly important to us, and we value each and every one of you deeply. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing and giving a like to support our work. We appreciate you more than you know. Have a wonderful day, and feel free to leave a comment with a phrase that resonates with the story, so we can know that you listened all the way through. Your voice matters.